My name's Colin Bennett from the University of Victoria, and Andrew and I are coordinating the section on digitally mediated surveillance. I don't have a PowerPoint. Neither of us have a PowerPoint. That's because I was still trying to figure out what I was going to say up to about a minute ago. There's clearly some issues of breadth and issues of definition that we could talk about here. And this is again a potentially limitless project in a potentially limitless larger project. But Andrew and I have been talking a bit about our observations on the state of the research, particularly on cyber surveillance and web-based surveillance in particular. And I just want to concentrate on that and what I have to say and make some suggestions to you. The other thing that was pretty obvious when we started this project is that the surveillance project has never actually done a workshop on the internet. And we thought that was a pretty huge gap. So there will be a workshop on cyber surveillance in Toronto in 2011, that's right. At which we hope to draw an awful lot of this together. So there's that gap, and that's an obvious one. But we've been talking a bit about what we see as the state of the research on cyber surveillance, and we have a bit of a critique of that, and we hope out of that critique can emerge some more specific projects which might rectify some of the issues and problems that we see in the literature. And there's four things that I think, from my perspective at any rate, when I read about the surveillance issues that are related to the internet, the World Wide Web, and more broadly the Internet of Things. And the first is that it tends very much to be episodic. In other words, the literature does tend to be concentrating on the particular issues and problems and tech companies of the day. In the book that I've just written on privacy advocacy, I did a series of case studies throughout the late 1990s, and it's, it goes from the Clipper chip to DoubleClick to Microsoft to Google, and now we're on to Facebook. And there's that episodic quality of the literature, which I think is somewhat problematic. Secondly, a lot of the literature does tend to think of this in a top-down fashion in terms of the relationship between powerful high-tech companies and governments, and not so much from the point of view of surveillance subjects. What actually happens? What actually is the effect? How are judgments made about people when one engages in online behavior, be it browsing, purchasing, searching, social networking, or whatever. So that's a second issue. Thirdly, there always seems to be some pervasive globalization assumptions here. That the technologies and the practices and the companies are just global in nature and are overwhelming distinctive national, cultural, administrative, political differences. And we see some issues there because the questions about the collection, processing, distribution of personal data are affected by national, cultural, administrative, political features. And so there's all kinds of potential to understand how Internet media communication is in fact affected and mediated by distinctive practices in individual countries. And finally, I think, and I guess this is a little bit reflected by some of the comments I see on the wall, there is a tendency to be captivated by the latest. To be captivated by the latest set of practices. So, everybody's sort of interested in social networking sites now, and Facebook, and without that sort of sense of reflection of where we've come in such a relatively short period. What is it, 2008, 10 years, 11 years in this incredible medium. So there's some general critiques about the way we think the literature has been progressing on this issue. And therefore, we think that there's potential and Andrew's going to talk in a little more detail about this, for research projects under this section to do the following. Firstly, to think in longitudinal fashion. This is a 7-year project, and the net and cyber surveillance in the year 2015 is going to look very different from what it is today. So there's some real potential to look, year by year over the course of this project at specific practices and how they might be affected by technology companies on the one hand, but also by evolving legal, administrative, political, cultural changes. Secondly, we also think that there's an extraordinary potential to do a lot more comparative research in the sense of trying to understand, as I said, how different cultures, different political systems with different regulatory regimes on privacy and other things, have been able or have not been able to affect issues such as law enforcement access to traffic data. There's some really interesting debates that are going on about data retention in Europe and how the data retention directive is and is not being implemented in different countries, the lawful access proposals in this country, and so on and so forth. And again, there is there's ways in which we can see how this same technology and these same practices do get mediated by different political, administrative, legal arrangements. Thirdly, we also think there's an extraordinary potential to look from the bottom up, from the point of view of surveillance subjects. I've written a couple of papers on the global, the GPD project, which simply began with a question, what happens when you actually engage in a particular technology? What happens when you book an airline ticket? What happens when you make a cell phone call? And there's potential, I think, for research to be done on those particular questions. What really happens when you do a Google search? What really happens when you engage in social networking? And to build, therefore, the story of surveillance and the story of the capture of personal information from the bottom up, and thus to see the contingencies, that are set not only by the technology itself, but by particular political legal regimes. And we think that that's one really important potential way to understand what cyber surveillance can do, but also what it cannot do under current conditions. So longitudinal, comparative, point of view of surveillance subjects, understanding the contingencies, and I guess the final point would be to render the technology more transparent, to render the practices more transparent, not only to the individual surveillance subjects, but also to regulators, to NGOs, so that a lot of the mythology that surrounds the net, the web, and the evolving Internet of Things, whatever that means, is informed by some clearer empirical understandings about what personal information is in fact captured, under what circumstances, what is it doing to individuals, and indeed what are the real economic and political motives for doing this. The fact that something can be done does not necessarily mean that it will be done. And so there's an extraordinary potential here for a whole range of really, really interesting projects, which we think can, as I put it just now, to render these practices more transparent in order to understand now, but also in 7 years' time, the scope and the extent and the problems associated with cyber surveillance. And now I'm going to hand it over to Andrew.
I did have a PowerPoint presentation, but for reasons too embarrassing to discuss here, so I'm going to enroll some rather old-fashioned visual aids here, which I hope you can see to some degree anyway. Oh, sorry, you don't need to see that. Sorry about that, Colin. So I'm going to cover some of the same ground that that Colin has, but from a slightly different point of view. And I'm going to start with my primitive understanding of surveillance studies as someone who has not been engaged in the network to the same degree that many of you here have. And I go back to a model of cybernetics, of control systems theory that emerged in the 1950s of the sort of cybernetic control loop. And this is a very simplistic model of surveillance and control, and it basically involves a loop here. And I've sketched this out. I hope you can see it. You probably can't at the back. But basically, at the bottom there, are those sort of red and green marks, are people, us, everybody, conducting their daily lives, going about buying, selling, talking to people, traveling, crossing borders, whatever. And there are various forms of watching. In the surveillance definition, the focused attention to personal details. And that goes into some sort of mechanism of logic of sorting, of classification, discrimination, which then produces, and this has effectors in the language of cybernetics, the kinds of influencing, managing, controlling, entitling, blocking, thwarting, enabling, and so on that then affects those people. So that is a general control systems cybernetic surveillance model. And I want to use that as a sort of background to talking about different aspects of what we might conduct together, what we might do together under the rubric of the digitally mediated surveillance IRSP. That model, of course, doesn't imply sort of digitality, although it is a cybernetic model in itself. But of course, since the 1950s, the introduction of computer and communication systems into our many organizations has increasingly brought in digital mediations of that surveillance apparatus or assemblage. And of course, it's not just a simple thing, but as we see, it's a very large and growing and evolving and contingent assemblage. So that is one focus of study. We could look at how the forms of capture, the logics, the algorithms, the giving of instructions has been affected and influenced by the move to digital media over the last 50 years. Of course, increasingly, our everyday lives are mediated digitally as well. First of all, in such transactions as ATMs and online reservation systems, but of course now in daily lives and through the use of the internet in an explicit way, and increasingly in sort of invisible, ambient, embedded, ubiquitous devices that are connected to each other and that can be designed to collect various pieces of information and affect what we do. All, of course, in the name of improving our lives and making it more convenient, easier, and so on. So a way of thinking about this study, this sort of the IRSP digitally mediated surveillance, is to look at various aspects of that activity, that practice, that technologically mediated practice. So, as Colin was saying, we're very interested in what are people doing and what do they make of the ways in which they are enrolled in this surveillance system. We're interested in cases, studies of what happens to the data that the people produce explicitly and indirectly through carrying out their lives, their shopping and networking and searching on the web and sending email and so on. So there's a whole sort of stream that might look up the left-hand side there in the sort of ongoing, sort of longitudinal, rather episodic way to try and map those out. At the same time, and I think my sense of surveillance studies is that it's more focused on the questions of the gaze, the observation, than what the consequences are, although, of course, they're both brought in there. We want to look for cases of people whose lives have been affected adversely or beneficially from the ways in which the processing of the signals in which they've been giving off have affected them. And that's a little bit harder to do because, of course, so much of this is invisible. But it's part of this enterprise of trying to make more visible these surveillance infrastructures. And then a sort of third area of that is to help reveal the logics that link the questions, link the data that's being produced and massaged from the sort of sensing side to decisions about sorting and classification, categorization. That's going to be harder to get to, but we hope that we can close that circle. And then just want to mention identification here, because it's the identification of the surveillance subjects, the attachment of unique labels to them, to the extent that can be done, which is seen as an essential ingredient of completing that cycle, so that you can link the actions taken on a person to what you already know about them. And so then the growth of identification, I'd say, is a essential aspect of that surveillance infrastructure and practice. So we hope that we can sort of engage you in various ways in doing pieces of that. This is, in some ways, a very broad canvas. We use a variety of metaphors. We heard about the umbrella of Irsp Ii. This is perhaps another way of thinking about it, as a canvas in which we can put sort of bits and pieces on, and that over time, the joy of a 7-year project is that we can build systematically and start making the links without having to decide right now exactly what everybody is going to do, but to provide a way in which contributions can be fitted together over time. So we hope through that process of particular studies, of forays into various aspects, different jurisdictions perhaps comparatively, different groups in society, so the demographic aspects, racial and ethnic groups, how they are differentially affected by these circuits of data collection and action. And this will hopefully lead us to answering some of the broader questions we pose in this sub-project. Does the increasing digital mediation of everyday activities contribute to extending the scope, scale, and intensity of surveillance and consequent interventions in people's lives? I think we take this as somewhat of almost an article of faith, perhaps, but I think we can document that in ways that are compelling. What meanings do people give to their digital mediations as they become increasingly subject to interception or collection or capture that which may be consequential to them in the end? What are the implications of increasing digital mediation of everyday activities for the oversight and accountability of surveillance practices? One of the big issues, of course, that's been raised many times, is that this surveillance infrastructure is opaque or invisible. It's certainly not transparent. We can't look into it. And that will be one of our projects, is to try to make this more available, not just to us as scholars, but to NGOs, to civil society organizations, and to individuals themselves, so they can begin to link their activities and their conducting transactions on the web to other consequences that might affect them or others. We've been able to do this in the environmental movement of linking our everyday activities, which are mundane as using hairspray or throwing away a can, to as sort of broad and very difficult to grasp concepts of global warming, ozone depletion, and so on. We need to be able to do similar things, I think, for the surveillance society, to reveal its circuits of data and power in ways that people can mobilize around them. And then what sites, moments, and players can constructively engage with the development and operation of digitally mediated surveillance practice to make them more effective, safe, and democratically governable? How can we develop a reform agenda for these surveillance infrastructures? So that's another way of a take on our ambitions here. As Colin mentioned, a major culminating event in this workshop will be in 2011, a cyber surveillance workshop. I hope that at that point we will have a rich collection of detailed case studies looking at individual lives or groups and how they have been affected and maybe changed their behavior, or what meanings they make of these surveillance infrastructures. But also, as part of that workshop, we'll be able to bring those together and answer some of these larger questions in an integrated fashion. We've got 3 years to do that. And that's only still halfway through. So I think I really look forward to that. At the same time, we will also, leading up to that, be developing a number of means to enable people who are working in this area to share their studies and reports, and of course in the usual conventional way of publishing papers, but to draw on other media such as wikis and blogs, just so people can see who's doing what in this area. And then finally, in terms of sort of the collaborative style, so our little pitch to encourage you to get involved in various ways in our project. This is rather like the Tom Sawyer project. If you recall, he got Huck Finn to paint his fence by making it look so cool. And that's sort of what we're trying to do, each of us, is to, you can come and help paint our fence because it's going to be a lot of fun and you're going to do it with some great people. And I hope that we've provided a sort of framework where you can see how your contributions will sort of magnify in conjunction with others. And we're talking not just about the sort of academics amongst us, but also the civil society organizations. We would like to have some influence ourselves on the course of the development of these surveillance practices and infrastructures. Our timeframes are long, but as Colin was mentioned, the debates here are often very episodic and for very good reasons. It's about media cycles, it's about what's hot now. And we hope that we can work with others who, in providing sort of background research so that it's ready in a way that can be used in much sort of shorter and pithier and tighter and sort of media savvy ways that can actually help involve ourselves constructively in the debate. So that's our sketch, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. So.